If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. The Architecture of Suffering. John Haviland's design created more than a prison. It built a machine for human transformation. The 7 cell blocks stretched like spokes from the central hub, where a single guard could observe every corridor. Each cell contained a cot, a workbench, and a Bible. Nothing else. The rules were absolute. Inmates received numbers, not names. They worked in silence, weaving or making shoes. Meals arrived through a slot. Exercise happened alone in a walled yard attached to each cell. The system called this separate confinement, different from mere isolation because it included forced labor and religious instruction. International visitors came to witness what many called the future of criminal justice. The French delegation of Alexis de Tocqueville praised the system's humanitarian approach compared to traditional dungeons. Other observers noted something troubling in the inmates' eyes. Charles Dickens arrived in 1842. He walked the corridors and spoke with prisoners. His conclusion differed sharply from earlier reports. The system worked too well, he wrote. It was breaking minds along with spirits. But which observation was correct? What the silence produced. Charles Dickens walked Eastern States corridors in 1842 with the careful eye of a social reformer. What he witnessed became a controlled attack on the prison system itself. In American Notes, he wrote that solitary confinement was torture disguised as reform. The isolation damaged minds in ways that could never be repaired. Dickens was not the first to notice the problems. Eastern States medical files tell a different story than the public reports. Prison doctors recorded what they called mental affection among inmates. These symptoms appeared within months of confinement. Men developed severe anxiety. Others lost touch with reality entirely. Some experienced complete mental breaks. By 1833, the prison's own physicians documented a troubling pattern. Instead of reforming criminals, isolation was creating something worse. The symptoms grew stronger over time. More inmates showed signs of mental collapse than officials had expected. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The prison administration made a choice. They buried the reports. Medical findings were rewritten or hidden from state legislators. Eastern State had become a model for prisons across America and Europe. Admitting failure would destroy everything. But former inmates began talking to newspapers. They described hearing voices in empty halls. Footsteps echoed where no guards walked. Strange sounds came from vacant cells. Prison officials blamed these stories on damaged minds. They were probably right about the damage. The question remained, what exactly had caused it? The Confessions of Former Inmates. By the late 1800s, Eastern State had quietly dropped its harshest rules. The hoods were gone. The complete silence ended. The total isolation became selective. But the building itself remained unchanged, and with each passing decade, the reports multiplied. Al Capone arrived in 1929 on weapons charges. Prison records show he occupied a relatively comfortable cell in Block 6. This was a man who had ordered executions without flinching. Yet within weeks, guards documented him screaming through the night. Fellow inmates heard him begging someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. The most likely Jimmy was James Clark, one of 7 victims in the St. Valentine's Day massacre that Capone had orchestrated just months earlier. Capone entered Eastern State already mentally fragile. He left it measurably worse. His case became famous, but it was not singular. In 1945, 3 recently released inmates gave independent interviews to a local newspaper. Each described seeing figures in the corridors after lights out. These shapes moved differently than guards or other prisoners. They displayed an unusual stillness before simply disappearing. The men had served different sentences and barely knew each other. The Science of Fear. When Eastern State reopened as a museum in 1994, researchers finally had access to study what the building actually did to people. The findings were more concrete than anyone expected. The prison's fixed stone walls and vaulted ceilings created acoustic conditions that bent sound in strange ways. Conversations from one cell block would reach another as ghostly murmurs, impossible to trace or understand. More important was what visitors couldn't hear. Buildings like Eastern State naturally produce infrasound, sound waves too low for human ears to detect. Dr. Vic Tandy's 1998 research proved these frequencies cause real physical responses: sudden anxiety, the feeling of being watched, shadows in peripheral vision. Eastern State's dimensions were perfect for generating exactly these frequencies. The psychology made it worse. Knowing the building's brutal history primed visitors to expect something frightening. When infrasound triggered their nervous systems, their minds filled in explanations that matched the environment. This combination explained most of what people reported experiencing, but not all of it. The accounts clustered in specific locations: Cell Block 4 and Cell Block 12. Witnesses decades apart described identical details that went far beyond what infrasound alone could produce. The penitentiary that would not die. The prison gates swung shut on April 11, 1971. For the first time in 142 years, Eastern State Penitentiary stood empty. Rain seeped through broken roofs. Weeds pushed through cracks in exercise yards. Urban photographers documented the slow collapse, capturing crumbling walls and twisted metal. Some left with more than pictures. When the site reopened to the public in 1994, something changed. The handful of scattered reports from the abandoned years became a flood. Terror behind the walls brought hundreds of thousands through the cell blocks each October. Tour guides began keeping informal tallies. Visitors started describing identical experiences in locations they had never seen before. Cell Block 4 drew the most reports. The upper tier of the northeastern corner generated account after account from people who knew nothing about the building's layout. Cell Block 12 produced a different pattern altogether. Visitors spoke of crushing weight, difficulty breathing, sudden silence. They used the same phrase repeatedly: the feeling just before something terrible happens. Staff members who worked there daily remained split. Some dismissed everything. Others gave detailed, careful accounts of their own encounters. One preservation specialist described entering a sealed section and sensing absolute certainty that she was not alone. She could not explain what told her this. She said she preferred not to know. What? The walls remember. 75,000 people passed through Eastern State's gates across 142 years. Hundreds died inside. Prison records document psychiatric breakdowns that officials often minimized or buried entirely. The architects built this place with one clear goal: break the human spirit to rebuild it. By their own accounts, they succeeded at the first part. The building stands as a monument to deliberate suffering. Every design choice served psychological torment dressed as moral reform. The question that haunts researchers is whether such concentrated anguish leaves traces that human senses can detect decades later. Science offers partial answers. Infrasound from old ventilation systems triggers unease. Suggestion plants ideas that bloom into experiences. Acoustic tricks create phantom voices. These explanations work for many encounters. They don't explain why multiple witnesses describe identical phenomena in specific locations without prior knowledge. Cell 7 in Cell Block 7 receives afternoon light through its original skylight. The architects positioned it to mimic divine presence falling from above. Visitors who know nothing of this history consistently describe the same sensation. The light doesn't feel empty. It feels like something waiting. The mystery refuses resolution. It remains exactly where Eastern State left it.